Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Joe Gaines, your host, and today our guest is Cesar Carrino. Now, Cesar, you're usually the host. You're sort of in the opposite position than you normally are.
I like that position for a change.
How many shows have you done?
It's over 300.
Over 300?
I've interviewed over 300 people. Right?
And just sort of to start things off, the concept of the show, the purpose of the show was?
It started out, 10 years ago or so when the Historical Society was getting started in Wadsworth. And someone said we probably ought to record some of these older people who are no longer going to be around. And someone pointed to me and asked if I would do it. And I said, I think I could do that. And I started with one person. The very first person was Orpha Huntsberger.
Mm-hmm.
And the next thing I know, there was a lineup of people, one right after another. The first year, we did something like 150 in 1 year. And unfortunately, then they began to die off.
Right.
Yeah, because they were old, very old people.
Right.
And we took all the ones who were in their 90s first, and then the 80s and the 70s. And after 4 or 5 years or so, we got down to the 60s, and by that time it was they probably didn't have enough history to talk about. But now that the people who are at that time 60s or so are in their 70s and close to 80s, we're going to start again to get some of the history of what they.
Well, I think the purpose is to show people, so the people who are moving in or the people who live here, what the rich history of Wadsworth really is,
right,
by listening to the people who have lived it.
It was designed actually for whoever writes the history in 2014, which is probably not going to be I, because by 2014, who knows, but whoever writes it will have at least some anecdotal records of what has gone on here for the past, 100 some odd years. We go back. The oldest one was 100 years old when I interviewed her, and she died just a few years ago, so that would go way back to, I know, at least 1900. Before
so
that, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Well, let's start from the beginning.
Okay.
Let's start with your parents. Your parents arrived in, your parents are from where?
From Italy.
What part of Italy?
Right south of Rome and north of Naples, right on the Tyrrhenian Sea. I mean, right on the sea. My mother used to wash clothes on the beach of the Tyrrhenian Sea,
wow,
which now is 17 miles of a summer resort.
Too bad you didn't have that then.
No, we didn't
now.
have anything then. They were absolute peasants. I mean, they had absolutely nothing. And now that sea of white sand, beautiful, beautiful white sand, I was there. But in the month of August, 17,000 people crowd into that little place where my mother used to wash clothes and actually desecrate it. It's just horrible. I mean, music, loud, raucous music, and beer cans and everything else, but they've ruined it. But when she was there, they were the only ones there.
So both your parents are from the same area?
Same area. As a matter of fact, they were in the same neighborhood. My father lived at one end of the row of ancient houses, and my mother lived at the other end of the.
Are the homes still the same when you were there?
Exactly.
You might have even saw the same house that your parents lived in?
I did. I saw the same house in which my father was born, and he and his 3 brothers and 2 sisters and mother and father all in the same room. No separations. Of course, they separated with sheets or something like that, I'm sure, because there were 2 girls and 4 boys, or 3 boys rather. And my mother's house was bombed out during the war, and the only thing standing was the stone bathtub.
Stone bathtub?
Stone bathtub.
That's interesting.
Everything was over there, stone.
Well, in the houses, if you go there, they're still there. Some of them are 500, 600, older than that.
Oh yeah,
but they don't rebuild like we do.
No. My mother's house was well over 500 years old. My father's house was equally as old, and the house of my cousin where I stayed was 400 something. It was a newer house.
Now, what were your parents' names?
My father's name is Ralph or Raffaele, and my mother's name is Concetta. Now, there are some significances there, and also some elements that are not significant. The first one is that all males are named after the grandfather, and that is the first one. And all males, the second male is named after the maternal grandfather, if it's a male, and the same with the females. My mother happened to be the second one, but she was born on the eve of the Immaculate Conception. Therefore, her name had to be Concetta, which means conception, rather than to be named after her mother's mother.
But that's a fairly common name, though, isn't it? I mean,
Concetta,
I've heard it
in
before.
Italian
Yes.
it is, yes.
Yeah.
Concetta is a very common name, Concetta.
Now, what was the occupation of your parents?
Both of them were dirt peasants. They had nothing, zero. My father began working in a brickyard, making bricks, you know, and so forth, at age 12. And he worked alongside a man who later became the father-in-law of my brother.
Well, that's interesting. But as a laborer, I mean,
absolutely.
The money to be made and the living to be made back then was in labor. So did your father have any education, or your mother?
My parents both had a third-grade education, but my father educated himself way beyond that. As a matter of fact, he knew world history very, very well, could read and write 2 languages, and had a vocabulary in English which actually outshone the vocabulary that most people would have. Knew Italian opera by heart, and read the Divine Comedy every day of his life to his death, and had memorized almost the whole 3.
Now, why do you think he did that? I mean, that amazes me.
Well, he mental curiosity, really mental curiosity. His motto always was to us that the road from this is of course translated literally from the Italian, because we spoke nothing but Italian at home. The road from the stable to the stars is difficult. You get there either by gold or by knowledge. We don't have gold, so you better increase your knowledge.
Well, they didn't have the opportunities that we have in this country, so they.
At all.
Yeah. So then he made the most of what he could.
He did, right.
Now, what year did they leave? Did they come to this country?
They left in 1920.
1920.
1920. And
how long were they married when they?
They were not married there. Well, I'll take that back. They were married there, but they were married only legally. And I understand that my grandparents both were absolutely ashamed that they were going to be leaving or my mother was going to be leaving the country, and she was not married in the church. So they came here, and of course she was in the hands of a friend of my grandparents here, and their instructions were that she had to be married in the church before she saw my father, and that's exactly what they did.
What were their ages? How old were they?
My father was, in 1920, would have been 27 years old, and my mother was 25 years old.
So they're already adults. They didn't come here, very, very young. They had a few.
In Italy, you're never an adult until you're married.
Yeah, this is true too. Very true. Now, when they came here and they got married, where did they settle first?
In Lima, Ohio. Well, my father actually had to come first, because you had to have someone to call you over. You could not come by yourself, a female particularly. He settled first in Ambler, Pennsylvania, and then from there he went to live with a cousin in Lima, because at that time the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the railroad companies was hiring in Lima, Ohio. And so he went to Lima, and then so my mother came directly to Lima, Ohio, and they were married in the Church of St. Rose in Lima, Ohio. And she died on the feast day of St. Rose of Lima, Peru.
Wow. So they moved to Lima because of the job was there. And then what brought them to this area?
To Akron. They had a big railroad strike. And they knew that the railroad strike would last forever, and it did. As a matter of fact, it actually debilitated the railroad so significantly that it never did recover appropriately. So they came to Akron because at that time the rubber industry was being, I guess, heralded as the place to work.
It's the early 20s, right?
Yes, right.
And more automobiles are being sold,
that's
rubber factories going.
So when they came here, my father got a job at Goodrich, and he was allergic to latex. something that they didn't call latex at the time. They said it was allergic to rubber. And now we understand that so many people are allergic to latex. I didn't realize that people were, but every time you go to the hospital now, if you have any allergies to latex, be sure to tell your physician or whatever. So he got a job at the Ohio Brass Company because it was not rubber. And his brother had worked there, his cousin worked there, and by the time all of these people got together, the entire department was all related.
So they're all Carrinos?
Well, not all Carrinos and Pizzarellis, right?
Yeah.
And then the father-in-law of one of the cousins worked there, and the son-in-law of one of the cousins worked there. So they all worked together.
What was your mother's maiden name? Just
Fortuna.
Fortuna?
Fortuna, which means fortune.
So now we have them in the Akron area. What brought them to Wadsworth?
Wadsworth, the streetcar.
That's what you told me we were talking.
That's right, the streetcar, because my father did not want to live in the city. They never lived in the city. Well, they did live in the city. I mean, in Italy, they lived in small communities, and then their farms, when we talk about farms as big as a kitchen, about.
Well, it was just enough to grow some crops and a little garden.
Grow for themselves, right? And so he wanted something out in the rural area. And he got on the streetcar, and the first rural area to which he came was Silver Creek. And the reason that they stopped at Silver Creek was that the coal mines were going very, very strongly at that time. And he bought the house in which I was physically born, and my brother Henry was physically born. It had been a reconstructed barn that was put there before the statehood of the state of Ohio by Mr. Sam Amwig, whose daughter lived across the street from us, and she died in 1944 at age 89. So you can tell how old Sam would have been.
So he moved to Wadsworth then, and he got the house on Silver Creek. Where you live now?
Well,
you live in Silver Creek, but you don't live in the same home.
No, as a matter of fact, I was born in that house. We moved to another one that we built in 1949. Then I moved to another one that was built in 1960 on the same piece of property. And then in 1992, it was getting too crowded. So we had, Linda and I, my wife Linda and I had some property on the street perpendicular to where we were living. We had 10 acres there. We had purchased it quite some time ago. And because the person had a fall and he died, and they wanted to sell it, so we bought it. So we built a house there. So I've never lived more than 500 feet from exactly where I lived. And my brother Henry actually was born and died on the same piece of property.
That he was born on. Now, what happened to the first house, the old barn? Was that still there?
The old barn, no. We moved that in 1949, about a quarter of a mile west. And
you physically moved it?
Well, yes, it was physically moved.
I understand.
And after it was moved, the people lived in it for years and years and years. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, they demolished it and put another house there.
So your brothers were born here? Well, in your family, all brothers?
All brothers, right? No sisters at all. My brothers were all born here. 2 were born in Lima, and Henry and I, we called him Hank, I never called him Henry. We were born in Silver Creek.
And who's the oldest?
My oldest brother is Crescenzo, who was named after his grandfather. And there's a little...
did he go by that name, or did they Americanize it?
Well, he did go by that name for many, many years until he got tired of people corrupting it. So he started going by Chris. Okay. And then he always kept that name then. I think he might have even legally changed it, but I don't think so, because that would have been a disgrace in our family to change your name.
So 3 brothers.
3 brothers.
Chris is the oldest.
Frank is next, and then Henry, and then I.
Okay, well, that's 4.
That's 4.
4 brothers. Yes. Okay, I said 3.
3 brothers and one, and I'm not a brother.
Right, that's true. My math isn't good. It makes perfect sense. What? Now your brother, you're the youngest.
I'm the baby.
Okay, and you were born what year?
1931.
31.
Hank was born in 1927. Frank in 1922, and Chris was born in 1921, 11 months prior to Frank's being born.
Now, do your parents ever leave you with any kind of stories about, like, when they first moved here, what it was like in Wadsworth? I mean, you obviously were here in the early days too, but what it was like for them when they first got here?
The only entertainment we had was listening to their stories, and we can recite them verbatim from the time that they can remember them way back in the 1890s until they died. They had one story, which of course they repeated many, many, many times, and that was when on July 10th, 1926, when they moved to Wadsworth. They were the only Italians, obviously, and the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross in their front yard.
That amazes me. I think a lot of people would be surprised at that. But it's scary.
The person who was in charge of that became one of our best friends, and at his death, he asked for us to take care of him.
So what, did they ever tell you why they would do such a thing? Is it just...
It was the way that people did.
Yeah.
They
looked at you
fear.
as foreign.
Oh,
and
foreign, right. We spoke as a result for the many, many years prior, soon after they got there, even though we lived in an English-speaking community, we were so isolated because of the distrust that people had. That we spoke nothing but Italian.
So at home, that's the only language you spoke?
Oh, right. And we learned English when we went to school.
Okay.
All four of us.
When you went to school, you started here in Wadsworth, obviously.
Oh, yes. In centralized school, I can tell you every teacher I had from grade 1 all the way.
But you only spoke Italian when you started to school.
Right.
What was it like, I wonder, for the
Very
teachers?
difficult.
And for you, too.
Extremely difficult to learn to speak English when you have a bunch of kids taunting you, and teachers not being too terribly helpful.
Patient and kind.
The one teacher who took great interest in us, two teachers actually, took great interest in us, were Laura Gates, now dead, of course. She would be well over 120, 30 or 40 years old, who helped my brothers, my older brothers particularly, to speak English. And then Ralph and Inez Rohr took a very strong interest in us as well, and I can still remember Inez Rohr, now dead also, but Ralph Rohr is still living. Ralph taught in this building.
Really?
He is the oldest living alum in the city of Wadsworth. He actually graduated in 1927, and he now is either 99 or 100 years old.
Now, what school did he teach in?
Right here.
At the high
Wadsworth
school?
Yeah.
So where was Wadsworth High School at that time?
Downtown. And then prior to that, he taught at Wadsworth Centralized School,
Okay.
which of course is now Isham School.
Okay. Now, when you first started, what grade school did you go to?
Isham, well, at the Centralized or Isham Elementary,
Which was located where?
where it is not right now.
Okay. And what was it like? What was it? Was it, you know, a big cultural shock to you? I mean, to be around so many different people? or-
Cultural shock isn't the word for it. I mean, I could hear a person talking. I did not know what she was saying. I would look on the board and see these letters, which I had no idea of significance. I had no idea, and they were going around saying these words or these syllables and so forth, and phonemes and things of this nature, and had no idea whatsoever. And on the second or third day, I got spanked by Bertha Kuhn. And we laughed about it many, many years after that. I just loved her dearly all of my life. She's been dead too, obviously. But she spanked me because she said, has anyone ever seen an elephant? I had no idea what she was talking about. I saw some hands raised, so I raised my hand. And she asked me, where'd you see the elephant? And the word that I could I must have said something like cornfield or something like that, because I didn't know any words. And she spanked me because I lied to her.
That's terrible. But it probably caused you a lot of problems that a lot of other children certainly would have.
I had problems speaking English until I was in the 7th grade when a very dear person, Elva Hartman Brentlinger Baldwin, whom you probably know. She taught in this building.
Well, that name's very familiar to me.
Taught in this building, was my 7th grade English teacher, and she said, Caesar, there are a lot of words that you don't say right. You're going to say them right. And I did.
So it wasn't until 7th grade.
Well,
I mean, you were probably learning by that time.
I could speak perfectly well,
right.
Except that I had, for instance, I can still remember boiled, B-O-I-L-E-D, to us was just bold. you know, and because in Italian it's burrito. So it was bold, you know.
Did you still speak Italian at home?
We never spoke anything but Italian at home. And now all my relatives are my friends, my brothers and my family. I'm the only one living. And I have had such a passion for being able to speak Italian that I speak to myself.
Well, I tell you that. Well, that's one of the things I regret, not learning Italian from my mother or my grandmother. And you always tell your kids that they should learn, but I was like, no, didn't want to do that.
Right.
So when high school came around, how different was that? Was it an easier adjustment for you?
Yeah. So I mean, by the time that I was in high school, I mean, I probably was as proficient in English as anyone was in high school. As a matter of fact. Simply because, probably because, not simply, but probably because I learned it in an academic setting. I always spoke it with a degree of accuracy.
Right.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I got to the point where I was correcting teachers because, you know, I had to learn it that way. And when I got to high school, I had a wonderful teacher, Elnora Davis, who took an interest in me as well, and she and Elva Brentlinger are probably the ones who propelled me toward wanting to make that as my lifelong vocation, and that is linguistics, and it's exactly what I did.
And that's why you got your PhD in, correct? Now, how were the schools different? You know,
Well,
I mean, I look at the elementary and the high school and the middle schools.
In terms of what?
Well, population.
Oh, population.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, the whole high school had only 300 people in it. You have more than that in the bathroom right now.
This is true.
No.
Well, exaggerating slightly, but what about like classes, like, you know, the courses and you know, like languages and stuff?
No, everything was very basic. You had geography, arithmetic, spelling, English, reading, and we never said physical education. I didn't say physical education until I was about 55 years old. It was always gym.
Yes.
We had gym. And manual training, or we called it, for the nickname, we called it shop.
Well, manual training would be carpentry,
Well,
vocational,
woodworking.
woodworking.
For males only.
Really?
Yeah. Then the females had home economics. We never were permitted to say home ec.
Well, so what? I mean, you know, you were kind of geared towards the academics. Were you involved in sports at all or anything like that?
I wasn't. My two oldest brothers were very good basketball players, but Henry and I didn't. We were born during the Depression, and there was only one activity, and that was work, because everyone was starving to death, and we worked from the time we started picking berries at age 5 or 6, all of us.
What was the Depression like here in Wadsworth?
Oh,
in this area?
mercy, it was horrible. I can still remember one girl coming to school, and to this day, I see her now, and she's in good shape now, but financially, I mean.
Sure, I know what you mean.
None of us is in good shape the other way. But she didn't have a dress, and she came in her slip, and she got teased, and it hurt me so badly because we were desperately poor, and that bothered me a great deal. One of our teachers said that his son came home from his little friend's home crying because they had no food and they had slaughtered and cooked the dog to eat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so things were bad.
Yeah, certainly. Well, it's hard to imagine that. It really is. When you talk about the Depression.
During that period of time from 1929 to 1937, from that period of time, that's 8 years, all of the neighbors in our neighborhood received some kind of assistance from the county, and the only thing that my parents ever received was a sack of flour in 1937.
Was your father still working?
Oh, he had a horrible time because they had maybe 1 day a week, sometimes none, and the IBEW, that's the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, unionized the Ohio Brass Company, and the management of Ohio Brass Company went to all of the foreign-born, such as my father, his cousins, and so forth, to ask them to to be strike breakers because they knew that they had to work, and they refused to do it. And my relatives and my father then were forced to stand on the picket line, and they were the ones who were gassed by the police.
Wow.
And my father would come home gassed from work. It was a difficult time.
Yeah, I don't think we can really imagine anymore. I mean, strikes and everything, and food lines, and even in Wadsworth. You know, we look at Wadsworth as being so prosperous. It certainly wasn't back then.
I can remember in 1935, I was, 4 years old at the time. It could have been, 1935. I was 4 years old. And the Sterling bread man, bakery, would come by each day. And he had a yellow and green truck. I can still remember that as if it were yesterday. And of course, my mother baked bread, but because we didn't buy anything. And I would go out to the bakery truck, because it stopped right in front of our house, for the lady across the road, this Mrs. Amig, who would buy one loaf of Queen's lace bread once a week. But
pretty good memory, Caesar. You can remember that.
And as he would open his drawer to get the bread, there would be these little pieces of cake or whatever, and I wanted one so badly, never had one. And one day, I was in the house, and I don't know how I happened to find 4 pennies, because they were only about a nickel or something like that. And I ran out there with those 4 pennies, and my mother saw me do that, because I brought the cake. The bakery man, gave me that little piece of cake for 4 cents. I'm sure it was not 5 cents, because of 4 pennies. I can remember that. And she cried and cried, because I had never had anything like that, and that there was not enough to go around, but we did save some for my brothers and so forth. But I still remember that as if it were yesterday.
You have an excellent memory. I'm
I can remember all of those things. Right now, though, if I'm talking to a man and a woman, I turn around, they'll say, were you talking to a man or a woman? I don't remember. No, I still can remember quite well.
Well, the Depression certainly had a big effect on you.
Very big
even
effect.
as a young child, a young man.
I was 14 years old before we had anything that was called normalcy, because immediately following the Depression was the war. I never knew anything, not my generation, never knew anything was normal until 1945.
So how did the war affect you? Now, you're obviously you're very young during the war, but teens, your teens.
Yeah, my brothers went to the war immediately. And the irony of this was that every male member of my father's family, and we're not sure about my mother's family, although we can go back maybe 1 or 2 generations, but every male member in my father's family had served in the Italian service. Most of them in the Navy, and a couple of them in the Army and so forth. My grandfather was in the Army, his father was in the Army, and his father was in the Army. And all of these people were all part of the military, because it was prescription. And as a person was born, if he was male, he had to register at birth. And that's the reason they have 2 different birthdays: the day on which they were born, and the day on which they were actually
signed into the.
That's right, taken to the courthouse to show physically that it was a male and not a female. And then they registered.
Well, why would they do that? Because some people would like to not get the child in. Yeah.
My father's name was Raffaello.
You could change that.
Change the name, but they had to physically take him and show him the genitalia, and then they would register for the draft at age 18. So what happened there was that my father, who was the oldest of the Carrino boys in his family, vowed that his sons would never have to do that. And that's one of the reasons that he came to the United States. And the very first thing that happened is that my 2 oldest brothers were drafted immediately when the Second World War broke out. And my brother Henry graduated on the 30th, or the 1st of June, and on the 7th of June, on my parents' 25th wedding anniversary, was inducted into the service. And all 3 of them were either wounded or gassed. Wow.
I want to keep with that topic, but something came up while you were talking. Your name, Caesar. How did you get Caesar as a name?
Dr. Johnson, who was the physician here in Wadsworth, helped to deliver me. I was born on January 5th during a very heavy snowstorm. My father had been a medic in the Italian Navy, And he was quite familiar with a lot of the procedures. I mean, obviously childbirth was not one of them, but he knew that he had to prepare water and he had to prepare this or whatever.
You knew the basics when it came to anything like that.
And there was a heavy snowstorm. And of course, we did not have a telephone, so we went to the neighbor's house when I was about to be born and called Dr. Johnson. And Dr. Johnson had a Model T Ford. I still remember it yet. It was a coupe. When I was a little kid, it looked like it was about 14 feet high, you know. And he could not get to our house until 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was born about 2 o'clock in the morning. And at that time, the doctor actually filled out the birth certificate, or the papers for the birth certificate. And he said, Ralph, and he knew my father, Ralph, what are you going to call this baby? And he said, Caesar Augustus. And Dr. Johnson, who had somewhat of a vitriolic tongue, but we thought of him as being some sort of a god, said, well, why don't you just call him Mussolini? And my father said, Doctor, very calmly, my father said very calmly, Doctor, I want to rear I'm sorry, he started the other way. He said, I do not want to rear a despot or a dictator. I want to raise a statesman.
Very good.
So that was his fact. Oh, my father had a very sharp retort for almost anything. In 1940, when we had to register, 1941, I'm sorry, when we had to register as enemy aliens, we had to go to the post office. My two brothers were in the service. And Hank and I and my father went there. I don't know why my mother didn't have to go. Maybe she was ill or something like that, but she didn't have to go. But the three of us went to the post office. And this arrogant postal worker, or the government worker, he was using the post office on a Saturday afternoon, looked at my father's papers, and he called him, Carrino? And my father said, yes, sir. He said, come over here. My father very dutifully went over there, and he said, I see here that you say you have 4 sons. I see only 2. Where are the other 2? My father said, sir, they're in the service of your country and mine, saving your life and mine. And then he said something in Italian and walked away, which was not nearly so cordial.
No. But I'm really impressed with his ability to retort, as you said.
My father?
Yeah.
Oh, mercy.
Okay. I mean,
a very poetic tongue.
Yeah. Plus, it seems like he had a taste for the classical. I mean, even
it was all classical, yes.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, we were not permitted to listen to any bad music. Bad music was anything other than
I mean, even
opera.
the name, Caesar, very classic,
yes, right.
and very, respectful to the past and to the future. Getting back, you just said something that kind of didn't worry me, but the thought I'm pondering about it is when you had to register as an alien.
Oh, yes.
Now, you were born as you're an American citizen.
He had to register as an alien.
Right.
And my mother had to, because she was not a citizen
Right.
at that time, although she was studying citizenship papers for her citizenship papers. But my father had to register, all Japanese, Italians.
Right.
And what really, really galled us is that the entire community was German, and they didn't have to register as alien.
Sure.
And they were the ones who were at war.
Yeah, Wadsworth was a very heavy in German population,
very
wasn't
heavily,
it?
yeah, surely.
Where was the post office at, just out
The
of
post
curiosity?
office at that time was, in 1937, the post office that is on Broad Street was built.
Okay.
Now, that's where we went. Prior to that, the post office was at 150 Main Street.
Now, how was the downtown different in Wadsworth? How did it look?
First and foremost, there were 4 rows of parking on Main Street, and also, well, not on College Street nor on Broad Street, because College Street had the streetcar track that went down there where the parking would be, so that they could turn around and come back and go back out to Barberton and Akron. The parking was parallel, angled, I'm sorry, not parallel, it was angled on both sides of the street and angled in the middle. And there was a very, very narrow corridor through which cars then could go. Of course, there weren't that many cars,
No.
number 1. Number 2, they all went much more slowly than they do now. And number 3, they weren't nearly so wide as they are now either. I mean, some of the cars were quite narrow, so that didn't make much of a problem. The other thing was that the stores that had been here for 1,000 years were still here. None of this that you would change the storefront every day. I mean, if you say that you're going to go to Prince Keller and Coons Hardware, that's where my neighbors went 60 years ago, and that's where we went. Or if you're going to go to Baxo's clothing store in the South End, that's always there. Hoagland's Hardware was always there. Brenneman's Drugstore had always been, you know.
Well, you're saying names that I even remember.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh.
Right.
So it's changed probably a great deal, there's no question.
Yes, right.
It must have looked a lot different too. I mean,
It
the
did
streetcar
look-
came straight to
So
Wadsworth.
It came up East Street. It came up the streetcar track to East Street, then down Broad Street, around on the north side of East Park, and then went straight down to close to where the Mexican store
Right.
is now, the Mexican restaurant, backed up into the North Park, and then went down and on the south side of the park on the East Park, and then went back out the same seat.
Now, you could take the streetcar to go to Akron.
Yes, we could.
You could do your shopping. You could do, I mean, Akron is probably a pretty large city, obviously compared to Wadsworth, but a pretty large city back
We
then.
never went to Akron. I didn't go to Akron until I was probably a teenager. We might have gone to Barberton every time, but you see, it cost 5 cents, and no one had 5 cents.
Wow.
My father worked in Barberton, and he walked to work many, many times because he didn't have 5 cents for a streetcar.
Well, we're talking a couple miles here, probably more than that.
7 miles.
7 miles, my. We
In the
wouldn't even
dark.
think about doing that today.
In the
In the
dark.
dark?
In the dark on the streetcar track, which was completely desolate. Don't know how he did it.
Now, we're get back a little bit to the war and those years here in Wadsworth. Were you treated any differently because being Italian?
The war broke out on December 7th,
Right, 41.
1941. I had a teacher, Miss Dorothy Huff. Rest her soul, she's dead too. Wonderful teacher. I really enjoyed her and liked her, you know, though she was the strictest teacher I ever had. And she said, "Now, boys and girls, let's talk about the war." And a little boy, Jim, I won't say his last name, got up and said, "I don't want to talk about Germany because Germany is our enemy." And Miss Huff said, "No, it's better to talk about your enemy and know who they are, because you need to know as much about your enemy as about your friends, because they are the ones who are going to hurt you. Your friends won't." "Oh," said Jim, "then we ought to talk about the Japanese." "Yes." And then all eyes turned to me and said, "And what about the Italians?" That's right. So from that point on, all the great people in grade 6 said that we were the enemy.
And were you treated that way?
Absolutely.
Wow. That's really strange to
Absolutely.
me. I mean,
I can still remember the girl whom I liked for a long time. Of course, I haven't seen her for 50 years now, but I liked her, and she got up one time and made some kind of a statement about a joke that she had heard on radio, that we ought to give the Axis powers 1/2 of the world. And she said to the teacher, would you like to know which half of the world we should give? And the teacher said, "Now, boys and girls, what half of the world do you think that we should give the Axis powers?" And I think I said something like, "Well, their half," or something like that.
Yeah.
The answer was the bottom half.
Nothing's changed in
No.
humor, has it? Well, that's interesting, the way you were treated. I mean, especially, you know, you obviously have 2 brothers in the service, and the war's going on, and you're very patriotic. Did that have any kind of impact on you as
Yes.
an American citizen, as a young
Absolutely.
man?
That plus 2 or 3 other things had tremendous impact on the direction that I took. Because my father was such a strong person in terms of how he wanted us to end up, and how strict he was in making sure that we got there. I mean, academically, we did not have choices about whether we were or were not going to study. We did study, and we knew that we had to. The fact that they were so vehemently, that's maybe a little bit too strong, but since there was a tremendous amount of undercurrent for this kind of feeling toward the Italians and the Japanese, not toward the Germans, because most of those people were Germans as well. As a matter of fact, both of these people whom I spoke were both German, of German descent. That fact made us, me particularly, fly the flag every day during the Vietnam War, because I felt so bad that there were so many people who had these attitudes.
Sure.
And we were actually, I was married at the time when the Vietnam War was going on, but we were actually, I'm going to say that we were threatened, not really threatened, but we were taunted, maybe more than taunted, less than threatened.
Well, you didn't feel secure.
Right, about the fact that we had the flag flying. And because they said I couldn't, the flag flew. And because they said that I couldn't go to, that I was going to the wrong church, has made me a person who has gone to church every day for 56 years.
Now, how was, in Wadsworth, back in the days, during getting back to the war a little bit, during the wartime, was Sacred Heart here? Was there a Catholic church? Now, it wasn't, what group dominated? I mean, like where I'm from, you know, St. Anthony's always had the Italians, and St. Peter's had the Irish, and St. Stan's had the Polish.
There were three churches that dominated. The first one was the Methodist Church, the Lutheran Church, and at that time they called it the Reformed Church. And they were all good people. As a matter of fact, my oldest brother played in the orchestra of the Methodist Church. However, that was merely an orchestra. We all went to the Catholic Church here in Wadsworth, but we, at Central High School, for instance, we were not permitted to carry our catechism books on the outside. We could not keep them on our desk. We had to keep them in our pockets. And we went to catechism on Friday afternoon. In 1923, and I have a letter at home somewhere, although since our move I have not been able to find it, but I do have the letter. It was written in pencil that many of the ministers in Wadsworth petitioned the school board never to hire a Catholic teacher.
Wow.
And in 1944, Lawrence Hawkwriter got a job here in teaching in Wadsworth, and he put on the application form that he was a Christian. He went to Mass on Christmas Eve at Sacred Heart Church, and when he got back to work on probably the 3rd or 4th of January, he no longer had a job.
It's shocking. That really is. I mean, you know, you wouldn't even think. I mean, to me, you know, we're talking back in the 40s. That wasn't that long ago. But
a lot of animosity against Catholics at that time. Now it's the largest church in Wadsworth.
Right.
And
was it very large back then?
Oh,
I mean,
no,
population
no,
very small.
No, we didn't.
There was no school, no Sacred Heart school or anything like that.
That came in 1949. I can still remember going to church with I would say probably not more than 400 people in the entire city were Catholics.
Right.
Now they're about 4,000.
Now, let me ask you, when you were saying about like how you were treated in school and so on, in school, did you have to, the pledge was done every week, or every day? Was there a prayer also?
Prayer as a matter of fact, I learned the Lord's Prayer in the 2nd grade because in the 1st grade, the teacher prayed for us all the time. The 1st grade teacher, as I say, I dearly loved her, and I maintained a friendship with her throughout my entire life until her death. And I still have tremendous admiration for her, Bertha Kuhn. But she came to our house to try to convert my parents from being Catholic, time after time after time. And she would argue with the wrong person, who was my father, who
Go ahead.
didn't budge. But she came to our house probably, I can remember sitting there listening. Of course, we weren't allowed to say a word, because the little children didn't speak at that time. We had to say good hello, and we had to respect her. Oh my, we had to respect her. He had tremendous respect for anyone who had an education. When they first moved there was a neighbor who had 4 boys. They're all dead now too. But 4 boys, and one was in the 10th grade. And my father, this boy has 10 years of education. What a brilliant man he must be. So I said, you have had 10 years of education? He said, yes, I do. I said, well, it's wonderful. Boy, you take mathematics? Yep, I take mathematics. And what about chemistry? Yes, I take chemistry. And do you take language? Yes. Physics? Only when I'm constipated. To which my father responded in Italian, what an ignorant person this person is, you know. He lost all respect for him because he was joking about something which is sacred.
Right. Well, education was probably, you know, looked at and thought of differently than it is today. I mean, when you talk to people about,
Right.
if you go to the 10th grade, that's, you know, you failed pretty much.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to succeed in life, at least you don't think you will. But education, your father put a great deal on it.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
you certainly have too. So, you know, World War II is going on, and you're what? You're about how old now?
Well, at the beginning of the war, I was 10 years old.
Okay. So you're almost in your teens.
Nope, not yet.
Yeah.
See, 10 to 13
Right.
is 3 years.
I know that, but my math isn't that bad, Caesar. But I mean, like, you know, by the end of the war,
By the end of the war,
you're ready to
yes.
start high school. You're in
Right.
high school.
By the end of the war, yes.
How are things different in high school?
Well, there was I would say that probably not a 180-degree turn, but there was a very, very sharp, precipitous turn toward, or for the want of a better word, toward an equalization, an equality among people. And not too much of this business that was going on at the very, very beginning. I didn't feel any sense of resentment for my
Felt like you were more of a part of something?
for my nationality. Did not feel the resentment toward the religion so much, although it was there a little bit, but not too terribly much. But it made a almost a parabolic jump.
Sure.
You know, instead of just a little gradual jump, a good parabolic jump.
Was it difficult, high school? I mean,
No,
the
not
classes?
really.
No?
No. Well, I'm sure that I could have applied myself better than I did, but no, it wasn't difficult. Well, after a person learns the language, I mean, if you can read and so forth.
You certainly were, you know, a deficit, I mean, a problem, not knowing language in your early years.
Yeah.
It had to be difficult to adjust to that. But now you're in high school, and you pretty much accept it. You're just one of the guys in many cases.
Well, yes, but then, as you well know, since you're in high school yourself, there are various cliques.
Sure.
And you know,
And they
have
existed
the
back then,
super
too.
popular and the popular and the athletes and then I was always associated with what we would now call geeks, and we didn't call them geeks because we didn't have that word in those days. But I was heavily oriented toward the academics more than
That's kind of sad, isn't it, when you think that, you know, you're there for the purpose of being educated, and you're oriented towards the education,
Right.
you desire the education, and for some reason you're thought of as being different because you want what's being given the opportunity to have. Did you get involved in any kind of government, like, you know, in school, like student council or anything like that?
Not student council particularly, but we had several organizations, and I was in all of those. And the reason for student council was that it met during the lunch hour, and I worked during the lunch hour at the B&B store. I got a job there after school, and we sold candy during the lunch hour, and I would go over there and sell candy during the lunch hour, so I couldn't work.
Now, B&B store, you mean bookstore?
No,
Like,
B&B was a B&B cut rate, then they just changed to the B&B
So
store.
it's near the school?
Right across the street where the dance studio was, and
Okay.
150, as a matter of fact, that's where the post office was. And in that building, the safe for the post office is still there, unless they had took it out recently, because it was too big to take out of the door.
So did you get involved like in any kind of writing or any courses like that? Did you enjoy that?
I did. I have always loved to write. I love to write. And still to this day, if I could do anything at all, I would be writing. And I served as a ghostwriter for many, many years. actually before I went to the university even, I served as a ghostwriter. And while I was at the university, I wrote volumes.
But you enjoy that.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. And how about literature? I mean, was literature big as a
literature
subject?
Was, you know, that I'm glad you asked that question. My wife, who was 9 years younger than I, went to Brunswick High School, and Brunswick High School was so small that there were only 52 people in her graduating class. And today, of course, it's changed. There are 18 more school buses than there were people in her graduating class. But she was heavily involved with literature, and we didn't have that kind of. We had the prose and poetry book is all we had, and some of the poetry and some of the prose was just so lame, you know.
Well, it's probably very old-fashioned.
Yeah, it was.
Very regimental.
Very regimental, right. So we didn't have that. So I don't have that kind of background. My bent is in what I really learned later on, actually, when I got my PhD. That's what actually, my concentration was in the philosophy of language, which of course is how to make language work for emotion, how to make it work for advertising, how to make it work for anger, how to make it, you know, and this is what I love to do.
That's very interesting. And
Yeah.
I think what's interesting too is that in many cases I can see the progression of what happened in school for you to kind of get you involved in that. I can see how it kind of like directed you towards that. When you were in high school and taking all these different courses, did you in many ways look at going on to college? That was just a matter of fact for you? Or was that a goal?
There was no
dream?
question. There was no question. We would go to college. And my brother Hank, as you probably know, spent all of his life in automotives. He has more hours of study in automotives than I do, my oldest brother or second oldest brother, and all three of us have doctorates. And if the automotive industry would have awarded doctorates, he would have had one too.
Now, what were the colleges around here that you could go to or thought about
Well,
going
the only
to?
ones we could go to were the ones that were very, very inexpensive. And we all got scholarships to Baldwin Wallace College. Can you imagine that? Roman Catholics being feted with a scholarship. My second oldest brother got the biggest scholarship. He got a full ride. He got $400 a year.
Wow. I'm kind of interested. How much did it cost, I wonder, for a whole year?
$854 for me. I went through Baldwin Wallace College for $854 a year. That included fees and tuitions, room and board, and expenses.
See, so we're talking about parking right now. You know, that's how much it costs for parking.
Of course it does.
In some ways.
Yeah. Now, the University of Akron had a college at that time. I mean, it was a municipal college, and they charged only $25 a semester to go, but you had to live in Akron. And if you didn't live in Akron, you had to pay more. So we went to Baldwin Wallace. All three of us went to Baldwin Wallace, and then my brother Hank went to schools all over the country.
When did you start Baldwin Wallace?
1948.
Now, you obviously had your license. You drove there. Was there another way of transportation? Or?
No, we went up there and we went into a room and stayed there. I mean, the room was a room. That's all it was. I mean,
so you lived in a dorm?
Kind
Would
of.
it be called a dorm?
It was a barracks.
Barracks?
Army barracks.
Your roommates, the whole thing, or?
3 roommates in a room the size of my bedroom right now.
It's amazing. What now? When you went to Baldwin Wallace, did you know what you wanted to major in? Pretty quick?
I was going to major in business, and I went to the business courses, and I did that until the 7th day of December of 1948. And I was walking to class and said, I don't want to do this anymore.
So you remember the exact date?
Yep.
That your mind changed?
And I walked into Deach Hall, which was the place where you did your registering and so forth. That's where the president's office was also. I mean, it was all one building. It was very, very small at the time. And I said, I want to be a school teacher. And the fellow said, are you sure? I said, you make more money in business. I said, I'm going to be a school teacher. Changed all my classes. On the 3rd of January of 1949, I began taking education courses, and I have never stopped.
What did your parents think about that when you told them you were going to go into education?
The fact that I was going to go be a teacher was something that would, to them, be the same thing as that you're going to be a minister in the Protestant denomination or a priest in the Catholic denominations. They thought that that was the best thing in the world. My second oldest brother was teaching college at that time. He was graduated by then. He was teaching college at that time. And my mother actually cried when she saw him in his gown.
Well, for graduation,
Yeah, sure.
certainly. Well, it meant a lot to them.
Yep.
Did you know you're going to college? You're going to be going to education. Your parents must have been very, very proud of that.
Oh yes.
What did you have any goal? What you wanted to teach in particular? What
Yes,
was your?
I wanted to be a principal, or a superintendent, or a dean, and I got all of them.
You did all that.
Well, not the superintendent. I jumped over that issue, and now I'm so glad that I did, because the average professional life of a superintendent is only about 5 years anymore.
Well, things have changed. Well, the interesting thing too is that your parents were really, very impressed, happy that you're going. Your goal is education, but they must have known that the pay wasn't going to be very much. But that wasn't a
lot more than they were
justification.
making.
Well, but still, when you go into education back then, you really had to be dedicated to it.
I made, every 2 weeks, I made $62.50.
Gee. And I complain now. No, I
Every
don't.
2 weeks, I made $62 to $62.50.
It's amazing.
I made $31 a week when I
Wow.
first started teaching.
And when did you graduate from Baldwin Wallace?
1952, June 8th.
Did you meet Linda at this point, or
Nope,
before, or after that?
Linda, I went by her house on June 8th for her graduation, because she lived in Brunswick, and she was celebrating her 12th birthday.
Wow.
She was born on June 8th.
So you are 9 years older, like you said.
I'm 9 years older, 9.5 years older.
So when you graduated from college, did you already have things lined up already? What
Yes,
you
I
wanted to
did.
do?
I went right directly to the service. I was drafted before I left college.
Okay, and that year is what, 50?
52.
So did you serve in Korea?
I was Korean War, yes,
Oh.
Korean War. And they didn't call it a war then, they called it a conflict. And when I was mayor, I went down to give the, or not to give, to help open the National Cemetery. And at that point, I was given a pin for the 50th anniversary of our Korean conflict. And they said, and we're glad to announce that we have finally declared it a war.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to end it now because of time, and it's probably a good place. I want to go on, and we'll probably continue our show and more interviews with Caesar. And it's interesting that you ended it with going into the service, and and serving this country and being a part of this country and being certainly a part of this city. You should be quite proud of yourself.
Well, there's a certain kind of humble pride that comes with all of these things, because the humility comes from the fact that my mother's favorite saying was that no one has any strength except the strength that God gives them.
Right.
And the humility comes from that. The pride comes from the fact that we were able to accomplish it.
Well, thank you, Caesar, and
My
I hope
pleasure.
everybody's enjoyed this show. And it's Caesar's show. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. I want to continue this
Okay.
and go further, because I think we're learning not just a lot about you and what makes you who you are, but a lot about Wadsworth and about the society and culture of our times here in Wadsworth.
Well, some of the things are really positive and some are not, but we
Well,
need to know both of them.
yeah, no question about that. Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
To Caesar Carrino, and thank you for watching our show. And we'll be back soon with another segment with Caesar, hopefully. Thank you.